I swear, I was just fixing up an old barn, 150 years old, falling apart, but to me, a treasure. So when the HOA called the cops on me, yeah, actual police, sirens and all, I thought I was dreaming. But then it got worse, and then it got fun. You ever watch a neighborhood turn on its own HOA? Stick around, this one spirals fast. And before we dive in, I really want to know, what's the most absurd thing your HOA's ever pulled? Drop it in the comments, I read every single one. This is QA Stories, and here's what happened. I'm Owen Hale, and I specialize in restoring historical buildings. But honestly, I don't know anymore. Maybe I love these old structures because my grandfather was a carpenter. He had this little woodworking shop behind his house. The smell of aging wood, the sound of his plane echoing every evening, it's still in my head to this day. When I saw this barn, I didn't just see an old building. I saw my childhood. I saw those afternoons sitting on sawhorses watching Grandpa's weathered hands transform rough lumber into something beautiful and lasting. I remember the first time he let me help with the plane. I must have been 8 or 9, standing on my tiptoes to reach the workbench. He wrapped his rough, calloused hands around mine, guiding the tool across a piece of oak. I can still feel the resistance of the wood, the way tiny curls of shavings danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the shop window. "Easy now, Owen," he'd say in that gravelly voice. "Let the wood tell you what it wants to be." That moment, the warmth of his hands over mine, the smell of sawdust and old coffee, the satisfaction of creating something with our own hands. That's what I thought about every time I looked at this barn. Maybe that's why restoring things makes me feel closer to him, like we're still working together somehow. So when I found this property with a 150-year-old barn sitting on it, I knew I had to have it. This wasn't just any old barn. This thing was a genuine piece of American history, the kind of structure that tells stories about the families who built it, the animals it housed, the storms it weathered. The moment I laid eyes on it, I thought to myself, this is a treasure. Sure, it was falling apart. The roof had more holes than a piece of Swiss cheese, and the wooden beams were practically begging for some serious attention, but that's exactly what made it perfect for someone like me. Every sag in the roofline, every weathered board, every hand-forged nail spoke to me in a language I'd learned at my grandfather's knee. What I didn't expect was Margot Lacey. Margot was 45 years old, perfectly manicured, and had the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes, like a politician at a town hall meeting. She was the self-appointed queen of our HOA, and from the moment I moved into the neighborhood, I could tell she saw every single house, every blade of grass, every mailbox as part of her personal kingdom. I remember the first time I met her, I was standing in my driveway, looking up at the barn and mentally planning the restoration work, when I heard these sharp footsteps clicking across the pavement behind me, like a countdown timer. I turned around, and there she was, walking with this purposeful stride, her eyes scanning my property like she was conducting some kind of military inspection. "You're the new owner," she said, "and I hope you understand the rules here." The way she said it, it wasn't a question or a friendly welcome. It was a territorial warning from an animal, marking its territory. Her voice had that particular tone that suggested she'd practiced this speech before, probably in front of a mirror. Announced by the loudspeaker, I stood up. I should have known right then. But no, I still smiled like a fool. Now I'll be honest, I thought she was just being neighborly in her own awkward way. I mean, HOAs exist to maintain property values and keep neighborhoods looking nice, right? I figured once she understood that I was planning to restore a historical structure, she'd be supportive, maybe even excited. I was so naive back then, like a lamb walking into a lion's den with a smile on my face and a pocket full of good intentions. I told her about my plans, how I wanted to preserve the barn's original character while making it structurally sound again, how it would actually increase the historical value of the entire neighborhood. Margot listened with this tight little smile, nodding occasionally, but I could see something calculating behind her eyes, like a chess player already thinking 5 moves ahead. She told me that any exterior modifications would need to go through the proper channels, and that the HOA had very specific standards about community aesthetics. The way she emphasized proper channels made my skin crawl, but I figured bureaucracy was just part of life in a managed community. How hard could it be to get approval for restoring a piece of history? Famous last words, right? A week later, I got my first letter from the HOA. It was delivered in one of those official-looking envelopes that immediately makes your stomach drop, like getting called to the principal's office when you know you haven't done anything wrong. I opened it, expecting maybe some paperwork about community guidelines or a welcome packet. Instead, I found a violation notice stating that my barn violated community aesthetic standards and needed to be addressed immediately. I read that letter 3 times, trying to make sense of it. The barn had been standing there for 150 years. It was there long before this neighborhood was even developed, long before Margot or anyone else moved in. Was I the crazy one here, or was the barn truly breaking HOA harmony like a rogue outlaw from the 1800s? I actually laughed out loud at that thought, picturing my old barn with a wanted poster. Dangerous structure, armed with historical significance and extreme rusticity. How could something that predated the community possibly violate its standards? It was like being told the Washington Monument violated modern building codes. I called the HOA office, thinking there had to be some mistake. The woman who answered the phone was polite but unhelpful, telling me that all aesthetic concerns were handled by the Architectural Review Board and that I could submit an application if I wanted to make any changes to my property. When I explained that I wasn't making changes but rather restoring a historical structure, she just repeated the same information like a broken record. It was like talking to a wall, if walls could be passive-aggressive and wear business attire. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, drafting what I thought would be a comprehensive proposal for the barn restoration. I included historical documentation, architectural plans, photos of similar successful restorations, and even research on how preserved historical structures increase property values. I was confident that once they saw the quality and importance of the work I wanted to do, they'd not only approve it, but thank me for taking on such a valuable project. Looking back now, I can see how completely I misunderstood what I was dealing with. I thought I was dealing with reasonable people who would appreciate historical preservation. But something in the back of my mind kept nagging at me. The way Margot had looked at my barn, it wasn't the look of someone concerned about community standards. It was the look of someone who saw a threat to their control. Holding that letter in my hands, I had no idea that I had just stepped into a war I was completely unprepared for. I submitted my application to the Architectural Review Board on a Tuesday morning, feeling pretty good about my chances. The application was 15 pages long, complete with photographs, historical documentation, and detailed restoration plans. I'd even included letters of recommendation from other historical preservation societies and examples of similar successful projects I'd completed. If this didn't convince them, I thought, nothing would. The woman at the HOA office stamped my application with one of those official date stamps and told me I'd hear back within 10 business days. 10 business days. What could go wrong in 10 business days? Well, apparently everything. The days started blending together, 11, 15, 20. Each morning I'd check my mailbox like a kid waiting for Christmas presents that never came. By day 20, I was pacing around my kitchen, actually talking to myself. "Come on, Owen," I'd mutter. "It's just bureaucracy. These things take time." But deep down, that sinking feeling was growing stronger, like watching storm clouds gather on what should have been a sunny day. Finally, on day 22, I got another one of those official envelopes in my mailbox. I tore it open, expecting to see an approval letter. Instead, I found my entire application returned to me with a single sheet of paper clipped to the front. I had submitted a small novel, and all I got was this pathetic post-it of bureaucracy. Additional documentation required. I remember staring at those 3 words until they started swimming in front of my eyes. My heart felt like it dropped through the floor. I didn't even know what they wanted. I thought about calling a lawyer, then I thought about money, then I opened the file again, checking every single page like I was a kid who got an F on a test and couldn't understand why. I must have gone through that application a dozen times, looking for something, anything I might have missed. That's when I decided to do some research on this mysterious Architectural Review Board. I'd assumed it was a legitimate committee made up of people with some background in architecture, historical preservation, or at least property management. What I found instead was something that made my blood boil like a tea kettle about to explode. The Architectural Review Board consisted of exactly 3 people: Margot Lacey as chairwoman, her brother-in-law Frank, and her neighbor, who just happened to be Margot's closest friend in the neighborhood. I sat in my office chair, staring at my computer screen, and felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't bureaucracy, this was a rigged game. For the first time, I seriously contemplated walking away. Maybe I could find another barn somewhere else, another project that wouldn't involve dealing with Margot's little kingdom. But then I looked out my window at that beautiful broken down barn, and something shifted inside me. No, If I let this pass, it's not just the barn they'll bury. It's every principle I learned from my grandfather about standing up for what's right. I was still processing this information when Margot herself showed up at my front door. The doorbell rang, and when I opened it, there she was, standing on my porch like she owned it, with a thick folder tucked under her arm and that same tight smile on her face. The late afternoon sun was behind her, casting her shadow across my doorway, and for a moment, she looked less like a neighbor and more like a debt collector. She told me she'd heard I was having some difficulties with my application and thought she might be able to help clarify things. But the way she said help made it clear that helping was the last thing on her agenda. As she stepped into my entryway, I caught a whiff of her perfume, something sharp and expensive that seemed to fill up all the air in the room. The space suddenly felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. She opened her folder with a crisp rustling sound that seemed unnaturally loud and pulled out a copy of the HOA bylaws, flipping to a section marked with a yellow sticky note like she'd been preparing for this moment for weeks. Section F-3-B, she said, pointing to a specific paragraph with a perfectly manicured fingernail. No exterior structural modifications without prior approval from the Architectural Review Board. But I filed the application, I told her, trying to keep my voice level while my blood pressure climbed toward dangerous territory. I submitted everything you asked for and more. The papers in her hands crinkled as she shifted them, and somehow that small sound felt ominous, like the first crack in a dam about to burst. Margot's smile got even tighter, if that was possible, stretching across her face like plastic wrap over a bowl. And the board rejected it, she said with the satisfaction of someone delivering particularly bad news. The board felt that your proposal lacked sufficient detail about how you plan to maintain community aesthetic standards during and after the restoration process. When I asked what specific details they wanted, she just shrugged and said that was for me to figure out. But here's the thing, she continued, leaning forward slightly like she was sharing a delicious secret. I am the board. Well, I chair the board. And what the board has determined is that your barn, in its current state, is a violation of community standards. Standing there listening to her, watching her arrange and rearrange those papers like a dealer shuffling cards, I felt like I was trapped in some kind of bureaucratic nightmare designed by someone with a particularly twisted sense of humor. This woman was essentially telling me that she had unilateral power to approve or deny any changes to my property, and she'd already decided that my historical restoration project was somehow a threat to the neighborhood. The worst part was the way she seemed to be enjoying it. Like this was all some kind of game to her, and she was winning by a landslide. She handed me another official-looking document, a cease and desist order requiring me to halt any work on the barn until my application was properly approved. The paper felt heavier than it should have in my hands, like it was made of lead instead of wood pulp. Then she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against my walkway with the same rhythmic precision I'd noticed the first day we met. She left me standing in my doorway, holding papers that essentially put my entire project on indefinite hold, the smell of her perfume lingering in the air like a warning. Watching Margot walk away with that triumphant look, I suddenly realized I had seriously underestimated my opponent. This wasn't going to be about historical preservation or community standards. This was going to be about power, and Margot had just shown me exactly how much of it she thought she had. The cease and desist order came with a deadline and a threat that felt like a sword hanging over my head. Stop all work on the barn within 72 hours or face a $1,000 fine. $1,000. For trying to preserve a piece of history that was already standing when their great-parents were still in diapers. I spent those 3 days pacing around my house like a caged animal, alternating between fury and despair. Here I was, a professional who'd spent years learning how to properly restore historical structures, being told by some power-hungry HOA dictator that I couldn't touch my own property. By the fourth day, I was ready to throw in the towel. The legal fees alone to fight this would probably cost more than the fine, and even if I won, Margot would just find another way to make my life miserable. I was sitting at my kitchen table, staring at that cease and desist order like it might spontaneously combust, when something occurred to me. If Margot wanted to play the legal game, maybe it was time I learned the rules better than she did. I grabbed my keys and headed to the town library, figuring if I was going down, I might as well go down swinging. The Millbrook Public Library was one of those solid, dependable buildings that made you feel smarter just walking inside. I found the local history section and started pulling books about the area's development, looking for anything that might give me leverage, any historical designation or protection that might apply to my barn. I spent hours going through old photographs, property records, and development documents, but I wasn't finding anything useful. Most of it was just dry municipal paperwork that could cure insomnia in 5 minutes flat. The afternoon sun was slanting through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the reading tables, and I was starting to lose hope. My eyes were burning from staring at microfilm, and my back ached from hunching over those old record books. I was about to call it quits when I decided to check one more folder. A beaten-up manila envelope labeled Miscellaneous Property Surveys, 1987. Then I got lucky, and I mean lottery ticket lucky. Buried in that folder, between a water damage report and some forgotten zoning variants, I found a single sheet of paper that changed everything. The paper was yellowed around the edges, with what looked like an old coffee stain in the upper right corner. The kind of document that had been filed away and forgotten for decades. It was a list of structures that had been surveyed for potential inclusion in the local heritage registry, typed on what must have been an ancient typewriter with a wonky E key. Number 47 on that list was my barn, described as mid-19th century agricultural structure of significant historical value to the community. The document was signed by the town planning committee and filed with the county clerk's office. I stared at that paper, my hands actually trembling a little. I looked around the quiet library, half expecting someone to tell me this was all some kind of mistake. That documents like this didn't just get discovered by desperate homeowners on random Tuesday afternoons. I almost shouted out loud in the library, seriously, thank God this was a library and not a bar. The feeling of finally having something that could hit back at Margot, it made my hands shake. I thought, this is it. This is the weapon I've been waiting for all these weeks. My barn wasn't just old, it was officially recognized as a piece of local heritage. I practically ran to the reference desk like a kid who'd just found buried treasure and asked the librarian to help me find information about heritage protection laws. She directed me to a legal database where I spent the next 2 hours reading through state statutes and municipal codes that made my eyes cross. What I found was something called the Heritage Preservation Act, a state law designed to protect historically significant structures from exactly the kind of interference I was dealing with. According to the law, any structure listed on a local heritage registry was granted certain protections, including the right to be restored and maintained without interference from homeowner associations. I printed out everything I could find, the Heritage Registry listing, the full text of the Heritage Preservation Act, and several court cases where the law had been successfully used to override HOA restrictions. By the time I left the library, I had a folder that was thicker than Margot's bylaws and a whole lot more powerful. But I wanted to double-check my interpretation before I did anything dramatic, so I decided to talk to Arthur Reed, my neighbor across the street. Arthur was 75 years old, retired from a career as a corporate lawyer, and had the kind of sharp mind that age hadn't dimmed one bit. He spent most of his afternoons working in his garden, and I'd chatted with him a few times since moving in. When I showed him what I'd found, his eyes lit up like someone had just handed him the solution to a puzzle he'd been working on for years. "Owen," he said, "you just found the shield that Margot can't penetrate. This Heritage Preservation Act is state law, which means it supersedes any heritage structure. If your barn is officially listed as a heritage structure, she can't touch you." Arthur leaned back in his garden chair, a distant look crossing his weathered face. "You know," he said, "this reminds me of a case I handled about 30 years ago. We were up against this massive development company that wanted to tear down a historic courthouse. Everyone said we didn't have a chance. They had money, lawyers, political connections, but we had the law on our side, just like you do now. The feeling when you realize that all their power and bluster doesn't matter because the law is crystal clear, it's nothing quite like it." He helped me organize my documentation and suggested I file everything with the HOA office exactly 1 week before their next monthly meeting. That way, he explained, they'd have to address it publicly, and Margot wouldn't have time to figure out a way around it. We spent the rest of the afternoon preparing what Arthur called my nuclear option, a formal notice that I was proceeding with restoration work under the protection of state heritage preservation laws, and that any interference would constitute a violation of those laws. For the first time since moving here, I felt like I had something that could actually beat Margot. The late afternoon sun was painting the sky orange and pink, and sitting there with Arthur, surrounded by his carefully tended garden, I felt a surge of confidence I hadn't experienced in weeks. But as I walked back to my house, folder tucked under my arm, a small voice in the back of my head whispered a warning. Margot didn't seem like the type to back down quietly. I had a feeling the real war hadn't even started. The monthly HOA meeting was held in the community center, and I arrived early to claim a strategic seat in the back row. My folder of documentation sat on my lap like a loaded weapon, and I could feel my heart beating faster as the room gradually filled with about 30 residents, most of whom looked like they'd rather be getting root canals. Margot swept in 5 minutes late, carrying her own thick folder and wearing a navy blue blazer that somehow made her look even more official and intimidating. If you've been following QA stories, you know HOA situations like this aren't uncommon. But this time I was the one getting dragged in, and let me tell you, being on the receiving end feels completely different. The meeting started with the usual mind-numbing stuff: budget reports, landscaping updates, reminders about trash can placement. Then, Margot stood up and announced that they had some serious business to address regarding property violation. She looked directly at me when she said it, and I felt every pair of eyes in the room turn my way like spotlights. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with that particular institutional hum that makes everything feel slightly dystopian. Margot opened her folder and pulled out what looked like a prepared prosecution case, the papers rustling with an unnaturally loud sound in the suddenly quiet room. Someone coughed nervously. Someone else shifted in their metal folding chair, which squeaked like a mouse in distress. She had photographs of my barn from multiple angles, copies of the original violation notice, and even a timeline showing how long I'd been ignoring HOA directives. I could see people leaning forward in their seats, fingers drumming silently on their thighs, sideways glances being exchanged like currency. This felt exactly like a trial, and I was the defendant who hadn't been told what crime I'd committed. Margot talked about community standards and property values, about the importance of maintaining aesthetic consistency, about how allowing one resident to ignore the rules would lead to chaos throughout the neighborhood. She made it sound like my barn restoration was going to single-handedly destroy civilization as we know it, complete with dramatic gestures and a voice that could have convinced people that the sky was falling. When she finished her performance, Richard Sterling, the HOA president, asked if I had anything to say in my defense. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "I'd like to present the Heritage Preservation Act," I said, and I walked to the front of the room with my folder. My hands were shaking more than I wanted to admit. I flipped past the summary page twice before finding the right document. My palms were sweating so badly the paper almost tore between my fingers. I explained how my barn was officially listed as a heritage structure, how state law protected my right to restore it, and how the HOA had no legal authority to interfere with that restoration. I showed them the Heritage Registry listing, the state statutes, and the receipt proving I'd filed all the proper documentation with the HOA office a week earlier. The room went dead silent, like someone had hit a mute button on the entire universe. Margot's face went through several different colors before settling on an alarming shade of red that made me worry she might actually explode. "No," she said, her voice rising like a tea kettle reaching full boil. "This can't be right. This is some kind of technicality. You can't just ignore community standards because of some obscure law." Someone whispered, "She's losing it," behind me, just loud enough for others to hear. I saw Richard looking down at his papers, suddenly very interested in his pen. A few people in the front row had their phones out, not even trying to hide the fact that they were recording. But Richard was already looking through my documentation, his expression growing more serious by the minute as he realized the implications. "Margot," he said quietly, "why did you mention any of this when we discussed Owen's case?" "I don't think you understand," Margot snapped back, her composure cracking like ice under pressure. "This man is trying to circumvent our authority with legal loopholes." Arthur was right. Watching Margot realize that her power wasn't absolute was like watching a dam burst. She tried to argue that heritage protection only applied to structures that were actively maintained, that my barn was too deteriorated to qualify, that I needed additional permits that didn't actually exist. But every argument she made just dug her deeper into a hole of her own making. Richard finally had to call for a recess when it became clear that Margot was becoming unhinged. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks, dreaming about the look on Margot's face when her little kingdom started crumbling. The next morning, I called my contractor and told him we were back in business. By 10 a.m., the sound of hammers and power tools was echoing from my barn for the first time since this whole mess started. I was up on a ladder, working on replacing some of the damaged roof beams, when I heard sirens in the distance. The sirens got louder and louder until 2 police cars with flashing lights pulled into my driveway like I was some kind of dangerous criminal. The red and blue lights swept across the weathered wood of the barn, painting it in alternating colors like some surreal art installation. Dogs started barking throughout the neighborhood. Curtains twitched at windows as faces appeared and disappeared. 2 officers got out, both looking confused and slightly annoyed. "We received a report of illegal construction activity," the older officer said. "Someone called in a complaint about unpermitted work and noise disturbances." I stood there, wearing jeans covered in wood dust, my hair a mess, holding a hammer in my hands, facing 2 police officers. For a moment, I genuinely wondered if they'd cuff me for repairing history. It felt exactly like being caught red-handed doing something terrible, when really I was just reattaching some 100-year-old wooden beams. I started laughing, half laugh, half frustration. This whole thing was turning into a comedy show. "Who called you?" I asked, though I had a pretty good idea already. The officer consulted his notepad and said the complaint came from a concerned neighbor who preferred to remain anonymous. I looked across the street and there was Margot, standing in her front yard with her arms crossed and a satisfied smirk on her face like she'd just won the lottery. She wasn't even trying to hide the fact that she'd called the cops on me. By this time, half the neighborhood had come out to see what was happening, because nothing draws a crowd like police cars in suburbia. People were standing in their doorways, on their front steps. Some even walked closer to get a better view. The officers spent several minutes reading through my documentation, while his partner radioed back to dispatch, probably wondering how they'd gotten dragged into an HOA dispute over a barn that was older than their grandparents. "Sir," he finally said, "you appear to have all the proper documentation for this work. I'm not sure why we were called out here." He looked over at Margot again, and his expression suggested he was starting to piece together what kind of situation he'd walked into. The younger officer shook his head slightly, the kind of head shake that said he'd seen enough petty neighbor disputes to last a lifetime. "Has anyone else been bullied by their HOA like this? Because, let me tell you, watching those cops realize they'd been used as pawns in Margot's personal vendetta was almost worth the humiliation of having them show up in the first place." The flashing lights finally stopped, leaving the afternoon feeling strangely quiet and normal again. But as I watched the police cars pull away and saw Margot still standing in her yard with that defiant expression, I realized something important had just happened. Looking at her standing there with that satisfied expression, I realized Margot had pushed herself too far, but I had no idea that would turn the entire neighborhood around. If I thought Margot calling the cops would be the end of it, I was more naive than a tourist in Times Square. For a brief second after that police encounter, I thought she might retreat. Maybe she'd realize she'd gone too far. Maybe she'd back down and find someone else to torment. But tyrants don't retreat, they reload. Apparently, being humiliated at a public meeting and then having the police basically tell her she was wasting their time only made her more determined to prove that she was still the queen of this particular castle. Over the next week, it seemed like every single house in the neighborhood received at least one violation notice. And I mean every house. It was like Margot had declared war on the entire community. At first, I thought Margot was just having a tantrum, like personal revenge stuff. But the more I looked closely, the more I got chills down my spine. This wasn't just warning shots anymore. This was systematic oppression, like she was trying to push the entire neighborhood into panic. I started thinking, if I don't stand up, who will? The Boyd family, who ran a small grocery store on the corner, got hit first. They'd had the same hand-painted wooden sign hanging outside their store for 15 years, but suddenly Margot decided it was 2 inches too wide, according to the commercial signage regulations buried somewhere in Section 12 of the HOA bylaws. An elderly neighbor received a violation for planting sunflowers in her front garden. Mrs. Weller clutched her sunflower citation like it was a death notice. Her lips trembled when she showed it to me. But she didn't cry. Not yet. Apparently, sunflowers weren't on the approved plant list, despite the fact that she'd been growing them in the same spot for the past decade. Another neighbor got cited for painting his garage door light gray instead of charcoal gray, even though the difference was so subtle you'd need a magnifying glass and perfect lighting to see it. I watched him standing in his driveway, staring at his garage door like it had personally betrayed him, the citation fluttering in his hands. The Hendersons were told their mailbox was mounted 3 inches too high. The family with teenagers got written up because their recycling bins were visible from the street 15 minutes before the official pickup time. It was like Margot had gone through the entire HOA rulebook with a magnifying glass and a bad attitude, looking for any possible violations she could find. She was handing out citations like a meter maid on commission, except instead of expired parking meters, she was targeting flower gardens and paint colors. The whole thing would have been funny if it wasn't so vindictive and petty. I was standing in my driveway, taking a break from the barn work, when Tom Boyd walked over. He was carrying one of those official HOA envelopes, and his face was red with frustration that made him look like he was about to burst a blood vessel. "Owen," he said, "I don't suppose you know anything about fighting these people?" He showed me the violation notice about his store sign, explaining that compliance would cost him nearly $800 to have a new sign made and installed. I told him about my experience with the Heritage Preservation Act, but unfortunately, that law didn't apply to commercial signage. That's when I made my biggest mistake so far. I assumed that people would be too scared to stand up to Margot, that they'd just pay their fines and keep their heads down rather than risk making themselves targets. I was preparing to fight this battle alone, thinking that nobody else would have the courage or resources to challenge the HOA. I didn't sign up to lead a movement. But maybe that barn, maybe Grandpa had other plans for me. Boy, was I wrong about that, and wrong in the most pleasant way possible. The next day, I had 5 more neighbors at my door. 5 neighbors, 5 envelopes, one collective look that said, "Enough." The elderly woman with her sunflower violation notice, still clutching it like evidence of a crime. The neighbor with his garage door citation, looking bewildered about paint colors. Even some people I'd never talked to before, all carrying those same official envelopes and looking for advice. As we stood there on my front porch, comparing our various violations like trading cards, a pattern started to emerge that was more sinister than random bureaucracy. Every single citation was for something that had been perfectly acceptable just weeks earlier, and every single fine was substantial enough to really hurt. These weren't gentle reminders about community standards. These were financial punishments designed to force compliance through economic pressure. I could see the stress in people's faces, the way their shoulders sagged under the weight of unexpected expenses. That's when Tom Boyd told me something that changed everything. A few days earlier, he'd received a delivery at his store that wasn't meant for him. It was a receipt for furniture delivery, marked for HOA office, but the delivery truck had mistakenly brought it to his store instead. The receipt was for high-end furniture, an oak dining table for $3,200, a leather sofa for $4,800, custom curtains, decorative lighting. The total came to just over $8,000. Tom had called the delivery company to let them know about the mistake, and they'd told him the furniture had actually been delivered to Margot's house on Maple Street. When Tom mentioned this to his wife, she remembered seeing a delivery truck at Margot's place the week before. But here's the thing that made it interesting. Tom had seen the HOA budget report just a month ago, and there was an $8,000 expense listed as HOA office renovation. I stared at that receipt for a long time, my mind racing through the implications like a detective solving a murder case. The pieces were falling into place in a way that made my stomach turn. If this was what it looked like, then Margot wasn't just abusing her power to harass neighbors. She was stealing from the HOA fund to buy furniture for her own house. The violation notices, the sudden enforcement of obscure rules, the targeting of anyone who might question her authority. It was all starting to make sense in the worst possible way. Would you stay quiet or fight back if you were me? Because holding that receipt in my hands, I felt like I'd just found the key to a door that Margot never wanted anyone to open. But more than that, I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. This wasn't just about my barn anymore. This was about an entire community being systematically exploited by someone who was supposed to be serving their interests. Word about the furniture receipt spread through the neighborhood faster than gossip at a high school reunion. Within 2 days, we weren't just neighbors anymore. We'd become something closer to a jury, and Margot was on trial. We sat around Tom's kitchen table, 3 people, then 5, then 8 people, everyone pulling out papers, talking over laptops like amateur detectives. Every new detail we discovered, the whole room would gasp like we'd just found winning lottery numbers. But this time, we weren't laughing, because we knew this was really big. Tom Boyd, with his business background, volunteered to organize our findings. The elderly neighbor turned out to be surprisingly tech-savvy and started taking photographs and making copies of everything. Even the neighbor with the garage door issue got involved when he realized the scope of what we were dealing with. When angry neighbors start working together, they can be more thorough than the FBI. Tom suggested following up on the delivery truck angle. he and his wife started paying attention to deliveries in the neighborhood, and sure enough, they spotted the same company making another delivery to Margot's house the following week. Tom chuckled nervously while filming. "Feels like we're spying," he said. I didn't disagree. But he got pictures of the truck, the delivery crew carrying boxes into Margot's house, and most importantly, he got a clear shot of the invoice taped to one of the boxes. The second delivery was smaller but just as damning. Custom window treatments and decorative accessories totaling $2,400. When Tom called the delivery company, they confirmed that the bill was being sent to the HOA office for payment. We now had evidence of over $10,000 in personal purchases being charged to the HOA budget, all delivered directly to Margot's home address. But we needed more than just delivery receipts. That's where Mrs. Dolores came in, and she turned out to be the hero we didn't know we needed. Dolores had been the HOA secretary for 20 years, and while everyone assumed she was just Margot's loyal assistant, it turned out she'd been keeping very detailed records of everything that didn't add up. When Tom approached her quietly about our concerns, she surprised us all by pulling out a thick binder full of financial documents. Dolores explained that she'd started keeping her own records 3 years ago, when she began noticing discrepancies in the HOA budget. She'd tried to bring her concerns to the board, but Margot had dismissed them as clerical errors. Dolores had been afraid to push the issue, worried about losing her position, but she'd continued documenting everything just in case. The evidence was overwhelming. Beyond the furniture purchases, there were fake invoices for landscaping services that were never performed, inflated bills for maintenance work, and consulting fees paid to companies that didn't exist. Margot had been systematically stealing from the HOA fund for years, and the total amount was approaching $60,000. We called for an emergency HOA meeting, and the notification went out to every household in the neighborhood. Along with it was a simple statement that urgent financial matters needed to be addressed, without giving Margot any advance warning. We wanted her to walk into that meeting completely unprepared. The community center was packed, every seat was filled, and people were standing along the walls. The energy in the room was different from the usual boring monthly meetings. There was an undercurrent of anger and anticipation that everyone could feel. Margot arrived exactly on time, carrying her usual folder. If she sensed that something was wrong, she didn't show it. Richard called the meeting to order and immediately turned the floor over to Tom Boyd. Tom stood up and said that some residents had concerns about HOA financial management that needed to be addressed publicly. He started with the furniture deliveries, showing photographs of the delivery truck at Margot's house and copies of the invoices that had been charged to the HOA budget. I watched Margot's face as Tom presented the evidence, and it was like watching someone realize their house was on fire. At first she looked confused, then annoyed, then increasingly panicked. When Tom finished, Margot shot to her feet. "That's completely wrong," she said, her voice shaking. "Those purchases were for HOA office furnishing. I was storing them temporarily at my house." But Dolores was ready for that explanation. She stood up slowly, clutching her binder. I'd underestimated her. We all had. But in that moment, Dolores looked like a quiet revolution waiting to happen. "I have documented evidence of irregular financial activities," she said, her quiet voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "The $8,000 furniture purchase is just one of several questionable expenses that I've been tracking." Margot's composure completely cracked. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising to near shouting levels. "These people are trying to undermine the board with baseless accusations." But Richard was already reaching for Dolores's binder, his face grave with the realization of what this meant. The room erupted into angry voices as residents started connecting the dots between Margot's financial theft and the sudden increase in violation notices. Someone called for an immediate vote to remove Margot from all HOA positions. Someone else demanded that the police be called to investigate the financial irregularities. Margot looked around the room desperately, seeing nothing but hostile faces. Then she ran. She literally grabbed her purse and ran out of the meeting, leaving behind her folder and any pretense that she could explain away what we'd discovered. Watching Margot flee from that meeting room, I wondered if it was finally over, or if this was just the beginning of something bigger. The aftermath of that meeting moved faster than I expected, like dominoes falling in perfect sequence. Within a week, Richard had called for a complete financial audit of the HOA books, and Margot had submitted her resignation from all positions. The resignation letter was brief and didn't admit to any wrongdoing, but everyone understood what it meant. The woman who had terrorized the neighborhood with petty violations and power games was gone, and she wasn't coming back. The audit confirmed it, tens of thousands stolen, paper trails left like neon signs. The auditors found fake invoices, inflated contractor bills, and even a consulting contract with a company that turned out to be registered in Margot's maiden name. It was organized crime disguised as community management, systematic theft that went far beyond a few pieces of furniture. Richard called another emergency meeting to discuss the audit results and figure out how to move forward. This time, the atmosphere was completely different from our usual HOA gatherings. People were engaged, asking questions, volunteering for committees. It felt like a real community for the first time since I'd moved to the neighborhood, like we'd all woken up from some kind of bureaucratic nightmare. Richard announced that he was forming a new oversight committee to prevent future financial abuse, and Tom Boyd volunteered to chair it. That's when I made my suggestion, and I have to admit, I was pretty proud of this idea. I knew it sounded radical, but after what we'd lived through, radical felt fair. I'd been thinking about the situation for weeks, trying to figure out how to make sure this kind of abuse never happened again. My proposal was simple but revolutionary. Implement a new fee structure based on actual community contribution rather than just property value. I stood up and explained my vision. Residents who caused problems or required excessive board attention would pay higher fees. Those who contributed positively to the community would pay reduced fees. And here's the kicker. People who helped expose corruption would receive special recognition in the form of significant fee reduction. The room was quiet while people processed this idea, and I could practically see the gears turning in their heads. Then the elderly neighbor raised her hand and said it was the fairest thing she'd heard in years. Tom Boyd nodded enthusiastically and said it would create incentives for good behavior while making troublemakers pay for the extra work they caused. Even Richard looked intrigued by the concept, probably thinking about how much easier his job would be if people actually had financial incentives to behave. We put it to a vote, and the new fee structure passed by an overwhelming margin that would have made election officials jealous. The new board spent the next month working out the details, creating clear criteria for fee adjustments, and establishing an appeals process to prevent abuse. It was everything the old system wasn't: transparent, fair, and designed to benefit the entire community rather than just the people in power. 2 months later, I received my first quarterly HOA statement under the new system, and I had to read it 3 times before I believed what I was seeing. My quarterly fee had been reduced from $300 to $120, a 60% reduction that made me want to frame the bill and hang it on my wall. The letter explained that the reduction was in recognition of my positive contribution to community governance and my role in identifying financial irregularities that had been harming all residents. It was like getting a refund on years of frustration. But the best part wasn't the money I was saving, though saving $15,000 over the next 10 years certainly didn't hurt. A few weeks after the new fee structure was implemented, I learned that Margot had been forced to sell her house and move out of the neighborhood. Apparently, the combination of the ongoing theft investigation, the social isolation that came with everyone knowing what she'd done, and the legal fees from trying to defend herself had made staying impossible. The house sold for 15% below market value, with the buyers specifically negotiating a lower price due to the HOA dispute history that was now part of the public record. Even better, part of the proceeds from Margot's house sale were eventually recovered through a civil lawsuit and returned to the HOA fund. It wasn't everything she'd stolen, but it was enough to cover the cost of the audit and fund some community improvements that had been delayed due to budget shortfall. My barn restoration was completed 3 months later, and the finished structure was absolutely beautiful. All the original character was preserved, but now it was structurally sound and weatherproof for the next century. The local historical society even featured it in their newsletter as an example of proper historical preservation. Several neighbors told me it had become their favorite part of the neighborhood to walk past, and property values in the area actually increased because of the historical significance. I looked at the new wooden sign I'd just finished mounting behind the house. The old barn now stood solid as a challenge to time itself. I thought, maybe what I just did wasn't just restoring a building. Maybe it was rebuilding faith in community. And maybe, just maybe, Grandpa was smiling somewhere up there. Standing there looking at my restored barn, I couldn't help but smile at the irony of it all. Who knew this 150-year-old barn would help me save money for the next 10 years? Turns out, it upgraded the whole neighborhood in ways I never could have imagined. Sometimes you don't need to beat the system, You just need to stand firm with what's right and let the system fix itself. That barn saved me more than I saved it, and maybe that's what legacy really means. And Margot? Last week I heard she moved to another neighborhood across town. I just hope this time she'll learn that community isn't about domination, it's about building together. As for me, I'm still here, with the most beautiful barn in the neighborhood and $15,000 saved over the next 10 years. Not bad for a battle where I just wanted to fix a barn. Have you ever had similar battles with your HOA? Or stories about communities finally standing up and fixing what's broken from the inside? I'd honestly love to hear them. Drop your story in the comments, because if this mess taught me anything, it's that we're not alone in dealing with power-happy boards. And if you made it this far, thanks for riding this whole wild ride with me. You can like, share, or subscribe if you want more stories like this. I've got plenty. This is QA Stories. And yeah, sometimes all it takes is one barn to rebuild a whole neighborhood.
From the whispers to the wreckage, QA Stories brings it all. Click that next video, if you can handle it.